Hi there, I'm Lillian. Welcome to my channel. Here I talk about what it's like to wake up one day and find yourself in a real life nightmare. You discover you're married to a covert narcissist. I talk about how I was baited through love bombing, trapped by a trauma bond, and stuck in blindness, unable to tell the difference between abuse and love for 34 years. Here I share my journey of how healing my feminine heart was the key to everything. I started to understand God in a whole new way, and His Word spoke to my heart in a way I didn't know it could. I learned to understand myself better and why I struggled with self-confidence, and why predators were always drawn to me. But the most significant revelation was that a healed feminine heart can drive away darkness with light. When I ended part 1, I said that there's a better way. Your femininity will make the marriage better, or your strength will blow it up. And that's not exactly what happens. It's God who uses your healed femininity to make the marriage better or blow it up. Here are 3 steps that you will cycle through as you heal. They're not, I call them steps just for ease of speaking them, but they're not linear steps. The feminine doesn't work that way. So the first step is to stop listening to Christian marriage advice that's coming to you from the masculine mindset. This is the kind of teaching that's vetted as acceptable through churches, but it didn't originate there. It's secular. It's based on the functional roles that position the man at the helm of the one-flesh marriage. The church claims to be different, but in reality, there's a single distinction that they both share. Once a woman gets married, she has no more feminine needs. All of her desires as a female are now expected to be lived out through the function, duty, and obligation of the role called wife. But with a man, when he steps into marriage, he gets placed above the woman because the role of a husband is above the role called wife. So he somehow seems to retain his masculinity. All his male needs and desires become preeminent in the marriage. Its newest name is called red pill, but in reality it's not new, it's been around for a long time. It's a tradition of men. It's when you take the true patriarchy from God and you live it out secularly. The Bible calls it a human tradition. It's when you take any practice that originated with God, like a marriage covenant, and you twist it to your particular purpose and benefit. Something that was meant for God's glory and your good ends up hurting another person. It's sin. Matthew 15, verses 1 through 9. These are the kind of mindsets and teachings that have been either crippling or killing your femininity. So that was the first thing. Stop reading and ingesting knowledge that is based in the masculine mindset. The second step is to stop focusing on your husband and the marriage. And the third is to start focusing on you. Steps 2 and 3 kind of go together. You know how it's impossible to stop thinking about a thing when you try not to think about it. Our brains don't work that way. When I say don't think about a giraffe, you immediately picture a giraffe. What you have to learn to do is preemptively replace your thoughts. So, how that application works with those steps I just described is that you have to recognize that you can't stop or control another person's thoughts or actions or behaviors as they come towards you. We don't have that kind of jurisdiction over one another, but you can change and control yours. So the more attention and time you give to your own self-care and healing, the more time you take to build into your own relationship with God, you'll automatically be reducing the attention and time and focus that's being wasted on a person that you have no control over. Your brain will take care of preemptively rewiring itself because that's how God created your brain to work. It is a waste of time to focus on someone who hasn't asked for your advice, help, or opinion, Someone who in essence doesn't want to change. They don't want to change how they are, and they don't want to change how they're hurting you. The only way you can heal is to focus on you. Whatever you focus on, wherever you focus, whoever you focus, that's what your brain uses to rewire. And that's why God says it's your responsibility and no one else's. It's your healing that God uses to help heal the man and make the marriage better. Or he uses your feminine power to blow up the marriage. So the covert narcissist leaves. 1 Corinthians 7:15 and 1 John 2:19. There's a deception in all the teaching on marriage that's inside the church. I experienced it every time I went to the church for help, which is why I say it's the first step to healing your inner girl. In their ignorance of estrogen and femininity, they've created a kind of Franken-flesh. It's a perverted version of the one flesh relationship that's nothing like God's clean one. This corrupted version is disguised to look like God's, but it creates the dynamic of codependence for a woman, especially if she's an unhealed one. The understanding of this corrupted mindset is that what a woman does is who she is, and that's just not true for women like it is for men. They're using the male authority in the hierarchy of the roles in marriage to abdicate masculine responsibility in the one flesh relationship. Can you picture it? In the structure of the marriage hierarchy, the role of the wife is underneath the role of the husband. The hierarchical image this projects is that one person is above another, not face to face. But a woman wasn't created in the role of a wife. Firstly, a woman's primary identification is as a female. In Genesis 1:27, God's first reference to her is as a nakeva. Then in Genesis 2:20, he identifies her positionally, where she's going to be the azer neged. And this is important. Neged means in front of, not beside, and positionally structured underneath the man, but in front of him, facing him. The next time God mentions us is in Genesis 2:22. He identifies how we are by using the word isha. And then in Genesis 2:23, the man acknowledges that her femininity is different than his masculinity, and he also calls her isha. And when God is talking about her in Genesis 2:24 through 25, she's still not called a role yet. The cleaving in verse 24 is about the one flesh relationship in verse 25, not the role of a husband or wife. He's still identifying her as Isha. So far, this creature has only been defined as who she is, why she is, how she is, and where she is. There's been no discussion of the activity of what she does. God never talks about her doing a role. He only introduces her as a female embodying femininity. So here's a question. Have they had sex yet? Or have they been just building a friendship? We don't know for sure because it wasn't until after the fall that the woman was given the name Eve, which means the mother of all that's living, Genesis 3:20. A man will answer yes to the question because he interprets sex as the relationship. But a woman will answer no because she experiences relationship to get to sex. When you take all those multiple descriptors that God uses to let a man know how to provide for a woman, and you reduce them into one single role called wife, you deny everything that previously made up that femininity. A woman is no longer viewed as a female, but only as a body that fills a functional role, because her position is ranked under the office of husband in the structure of marriage. Her unique personal femininity disappears and loses its power. Everything that God created her to be, the nakeva, the azar neged, and the isha, It's all eliminated through marriage as she's moved into the position that ranks underneath. Marriage takes all a woman's true feminine nature that captured the attention of the masculinity, and it repositions it so it becomes unseen and not important. Yet, for a man, when he gets married, he not only gets to keep all his masculine needs and wants, but they are catapulted into priority, because in that hierarchical vertical structure, a husband ranks above the position of wife. That's not a relationship. It's covering up all the femininity that made her a woman in the first place, so that a man can extract from her, instead of his masculinity providing for her femininity. When you only live in the designated roles of marriage, there's no space provided for the one-flesh relationship to exist. A true one-flesh marriage comprises both roles and relationship. Without the one-flesh relationship, the only thing that's left is to operate in the function, duty, and obligation that has been passed down through the tradition of men. Pretending that there's a real relationship happening is a deception. God's creation is the opposite of that. When his healthy one-flesh relationship is lived out, femininity never disappears inside masculinity. The feminine and masculine polarities are alive and moving. The healthy one-flesh relationship is created through the movement of masculinity cleaving to femininity. Cleaving done right culminates in the highest form of friendship between a man and a woman, sex. Masculinity wants to be consumed by femininity. It's not the other way around. That's what Paul is explaining to us in Ephesians 5. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This mystery is profound, but I am talking about Christ and the church. This mysterious comparison that Paul's talking about is the masculine and feminine polarity of the one-flesh relationship, not the roles of husband and wife. When you turn your relationship with Christ into dutiful actions, what you have is religious function, and there's nothing mysterious about that. You know, when Christ tells us, the body, to consume his blood and body, in Paul's explanation of this great mystery, what he's saying is that if a husband represents Christ and a wife represents the body in the one-flesh dynamic, there's an imagery here. Pay attention. He's showing that it's femininity that consumes masculinity. That's the great mystery. Masculinity is the source for femininity, just like the head is the source for the body. God used the man as the source to create the woman. She was taken out of him. But a toxic man consumes femininity as his source instead of building his masculinity by providing himself as her source. A relationship can't be lived out through a role, because in the structure, all you have is function. If there is no emotions acknowledged, if there's no feelings accepted, celebrated, and validated, all you have is obligation. In this mindset, all a woman can do is function in her duty, which is lived out in the smallest part of her being. That's her 10% testosterone. More on that in a bit. If there's no mysterious relationship intentionally being cultivated by masculine cleaving, there can be no one-flesh relationship. It just seems like there is. Here's what that discussion might look like. Well, here's what one of them looked like in my real life as I tried to get him to stop extracting from my femininity. It was about 20 years into the marriage, and I got tired of the same conversation and nothing changing or fake changing. And that means he would change for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then it would return back to the way it was. So I basically told him that I needed to do his part in the marriage, and that men and women are different, and I need different things than he does, and that I needed for him to initiate the relationship. And I said that we've had this conversation too many times, and that I needed for him to be more invested in my heart as a woman and to learn what it means to be the head. I believed that because he was now professing that he was a Christian, that this conversation would have been received in a different way than it had been every other time in the past. And it was. It was explosive and much more volatile. His tone was measured, slow, and low at first. He said, "I know how to be in charge and lead. I do it every day, all week. That's why I delegate the relationship to you. You're not submissive because you don't do what I'm telling you to do. I can't lead you because of you. You're too strong-willed. You won't do anything I'm telling you to do. You don't want to follow my leadership as the head. I am leading. You won't follow." I tried to explain that I don't want leadership like I'm an employee, that I need the intentionality of masculine headship in the relationship. He began to elevate his speech and raged at me with verbal abuse and word salad as he stepped physically closer into my space. He said that I was the problem because of all my Bible studying and all these years, and coming from an alcoholic home and being sexually abused has affected my ability to learn because I still don't understand what real submission is, and that I would never understand. And so we never had the conversation again. I just held the reins of responsibility in my hands and pretended that femininity existed inside me because I lived inside a woman's body. That's an example of what toxic masculinity looks like. This is what happens when the patriarchy is hijacked by Satan and it pretends to be Christian. And why you never, ever believe any person who says they are a believer unless there's fruit to match. Even if only a small amount of fruit at the beginning, and even if that person is living in your own home, it's got to be present in your experience of a relationship with that person. And the churches are aligned with this model, this toxic tradition of men. We know this because whenever there's a problem in the one-flesh relationship, the solution is always found in the hierarchical structure of the roles. It's always because the wife is not staying in her own lane under the office of the husband. It's always a lack of submission, or doing it wrong, or not well enough or long enough, not trying hard enough. Not enough respect in the right way. That's the masculine mindset. Whenever the solution is doing something, doing anything, you're ingesting instruction from a masculine mindset. Even if it's a woman telling you, whenever the answer for any marriage problem is rooted in the structure, the message you hear is, do more function, do greater obligation, do deeper submission, do submission and respect more or differently. Women married to difficult husbands, not dangerous ones, have been paralyzed by this masculine mindset within Christendom. Women cannot heal themselves because no one is showing them how to step out of this masculine mindset. So marriages are dying instead of growing and resembling Christ and his church. But when it comes to the sisters like me, the ones that aren't just bruised and completely brokenhearted, this model for marriage that's got nothing to do with God's one-flesh relationship, well, this view of do more, it fits beautifully for covert domestic violence. This is how a wolf is able to maneuver behind closed doors in a supposed Christian marriage, all the while creating the toxic, disfigured Franken-flesh. They just thrive when a woman's femininity is unhealed because she's weak and people-pleasing. That was me. I embodied fawning, thinking it was femininity. because that was the way the Christian leadership told me to live with the predator, and I believed them. The only way to heal is from God Himself, not a church and not church programs. You can't keep relearning the same information and expecting different results. It doesn't work that way. Anytime a church identifies as a Christian denomination, I can guarantee you they're all using the same ideological resources. You're just hearing it in a different voice or seeing it in a different medium. It's all the same masculine mindset teaching. It's just in different packages. Christendom is failing you as a daughter of God, just like when the shepherds failed the Israelites. God will take you by the hand and rescue and heal and restore you Himself. Read Ezekiel 34 and tell me if you don't feel exactly like an individual that's been abandoned in the same way the shepherds abandoned their own sheep. In 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Corinthians 10, there's a method of reasoning that we can apply to marriage. It'll begin to take away the masculine teaching you've received. In these two portions, there are different applications, but basically God is saying the same thing in both of them. Just because you can do a thing, it doesn't mean you should. Just because you think you can motivate, teach, coach, and encourage the man to be the kind of man you think he should be, should you do that? Because as women, we do have access to that kind of power. Femininity has the power to manipulate behaviors. But you've got to ask yourself, what is the benefit for you? You've got to ask yourself, what is the benefit for him? If you take on the responsibility for his masculinity instead of being 100% responsible just for your own femininity, will it be beneficial for you? It didn't go well for humanity when Adam stepped back and Eve stepped forward to take responsibility for Adam. If you would have asked me, I would have said, I'm being a helper. I wouldn't have believed that I was doing anything unhealthy or hurting anyone, especially me. When we're unhealed, we think this way at such a deep level because we've been doing it so long. We don't know any other way other than to overthink and overfunction in order to try and solve the problems in our marriages. If you're unhealed, broken, or unskilled, you can't help it. God created you with diffuse awareness. And remember, that means you're hyper-aware of everything in your sphere. You can't just shut your eyes and close your ears and ignore the problems the way a man can. He can move into a different box inside his mind, and that problem, the feeling and knowledge of it, literally disappears off his radar. When there's something that's wrong in a woman's life, it doesn't just go away when it's ignored, because we can't ignore like in compartmentalization. Instead, these problems are flags that are constantly waving in front of our face, or like a drum that's beating in our ears. It's a noise we can't turn off. Let's say if your husband promised you that he would clean your car every weekend for you, but then doesn't. There's a drum that beats inside your ears every time you get inside that dirty car. And what you hear is, you don't matter. You're invisible. You don't matter. You're not worth the work. And it doesn't stop until the car is cleaned. One option is to remind him. We call this communication, but in reality what's happening is nagging. So we nag, or we solve the problem ourselves to quiet that drumbeat. And the effect of this is a lowered trust in his masculinity and an increased trust in your own. But the most damaging option is to quiet the drumbeat by pushing down your femininity and ignoring all your feelings and emotions that come from that 90% estrogenated body. Estrogenated, I'm not sure that's a word, but it feels right here. If you ignore that largest part of your thinking, it means you shut yourself down by believing the message. that your feelings are irrelevant. They don't matter. You don't matter. He matters. Your estrogen sees any problem, all of them, that are not being solved, and your masculinity naturally moves forward to do it. It's either a bad decision or the dangerous one. A bad decision means that you'll employ strategies for particular outcomes in the marriage, and that's not whiffery, it's mothering. Loving your husband is very different than loving your kids, and honestly, when your femininity is not healed, you can't know the difference. We know adult males aren't children, but still, most of us end up relating to them like they are. The fact is that I wanted to say, just clean the car like you promised you would. That's how you talk to a child when you're training their character, not how you talk to a man. But you don't know any other way because you've not been taught how to think inside what you feel. Cleaning the car is not about his promise. It's not about him at all. It's about how you feel when you get into the car. The noise you feel from the mess. Do you see the difference? You own the responsibility for how you feel. That noise that's inside you is because that's how God created you to be. You can blame the man for the noise and stay the same, or you can take responsibility for you. We think that because we're women and we're talking, that automatically makes all of our words feminine, no matter who they're directed at. We've not been taught the differences within each hormone. Instead, we've been taught how to act like wives and mothers, which is operating in your masculine mindset. No one has told us what it feels like to be in relationship with masculinity. We don't know how to understand the male species. So in practice, most of the time, we end up emasculating with the words that we use. We've not been taught how to be feminine around men. So we stay in that masculine mindset and we try to relate to them as if we are men, because we think that they'll understand what we're trying to tell them, but it doesn't work that way. A healthy husband gets more disconnected because his goal is not to penetrate forward into masculinity. He wants to move forward into femininity. This is how you get difficulty and dysfunction in your marriage. When a husband is healthy but unskilled as to how to deal with femininity, it shows in his efforts. They're klutzy or clumsy or clueless. He's not grown into his swag with you yet. Swag takes time and practice. So, at the first sign of any possible rejection of his efforts, he pulls back. He has to preserve his masculinity, and that's the safest way for both of you. When it comes to the dangerous man, though, he wants you to stay in your masculine because he knows you're really a woman and you don't possess the testosterone to be an equal match for him. He's got 90%. You've only got 10. You're at a clear disadvantage, and a predator knows that. He knows that if you're not thinking in your estrogen feelings, you're unhealed, he can keep withholding all that connection and affection that is the provision for your femininity. Then he can turn around and blame you for it. I wish someone would have told me that there were different kinds of love and that they would have taught me what they mean. I don't mean that theory of the marriage book called The 5 Love Languages. I mean Paul's truth about love in Titus 2. He said, encourage the young wives to love their husbands and to love their children. He made it so easy to understand by using 2 different words, but without proper exegesis, it gets lost in the English translations. When you live your life from the masculine mindset, this distinction from Paul gets obscured because love means something different to men than it does to women. You think, well, of course you love a man differently than you love a child. That's obvious. Because in the masculine understanding, which is driven by testosterone, right? Love is primarily sex. making the two different kinds of love apparent but unspoken. But it's not to a woman, because we focus on the word love. And when you look at the same words in English and it's repeated, that leads us to believe that love is love. Remember in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul talks about the feminine receiving her due benevolence before the man, because due benevolence is interpreted by a man as primarily sexual, but to us females, it's primarily relationship and friendship. It gets confusing to us because it's always about relationship with us. So we, women I mean, we express kindness, friendship, and generosity the same way, whether we're talking to a husband or a child. And that's what God is telling us is wrong. There's two different kinds of love that God wants us to learn to orient from. That's why he used two different words here, because there's two different relationships. There's two completely different connection points. Those connection points are the difference between training a husband and teaching a child. You can train a husband how to be in relationship with you if he's healthy, not perfect, but healthy. He'll take that knowledge and learn from it and self-correct. You love a man by training him, and he does the teaching of himself. But with children, you love them by teaching them directly how to develop into responsible adults. In the example of cleaning my car, if I was to have said, just clean the car like you promised you would, I'm pointing out, one, that he's irresponsible because he's not doing the job, and two, I'm also pointing out that he lacks in integrity because he didn't keep his word. It's a different skill set in a different language. When you try and teach your husband, it translates into you treating him like a child. He can feel it, and it's not only insulting, but the outcome is that you end up removing that connection point for balanced partnership, friendship, and any romantic intentions from him. Teaching your husband looks like you're trying to put the reins of responsibility into his hands because he won't pick them up. You need to drop those reins and just assume full responsibility for your own part in the relationship and ignore the failure of masculinity. I talk about dropping the reins of control in the video I made, How to Walk Away in Marriage Without Leaving. I'll put a link for that in the description box. We've been led to believe that if we motivate, inspire, and encourage and coach, which all sound like great things, that's being a helper to the man. It's not. That's how you love children. It's how you emasculate a man, and it's how you force him into relational disconnection and laziness. It's the antitheses of loving a man. A man is created to be self-creating, self-teaching, and self-correcting. He can't be taught by you and himself. His motivation is already internally wired. He's his own boss and his own worst critic. That's how God wired a man's masculinity. He wired the feminine nature different, and he did it for our own safety because he knew when he created Eve, a woman's life was going to be lived out in a fallen world. He preemptively gave us protection. A wife not only has the ability to preserve her own femininity, but when she embodies that, she's actively cooperating with God's design of masculinity. This means she's training instead of teaching. By training instead of teaching, he's forced to figure it out on his own, and that translates to him experiencing accomplishment in the relationship. And the more a man accomplishes, the more masculine he feels. He's better, you're better, and the marriage is a more accurate reflection from Ephesians 5, which is what God intended. Now, with a wolf, you're still the same feminine embodiment. You live your life the same way so that you end up training him. But there's a completely different outcome when you're married to a covert narcissist. Embodied femininity, when it's healed, is soft and strong at the same time. That's the power of femininity. there's going to be a completely different response from a dangerous man than from a healthy one. This is why you have to be wary of marriage advice that says communication is always the best choice. The advice is wrong. Communication is the last action for a wife to take. It's the first course of action for a man to take with a woman. Actions are how a man best reads you. Actions and behaviors are the language of men. Words aren't their thing. In Ephesians 5, 28 through 29, God says, it's a healthy man who cares for his own body. That self-care includes his masculinity, which is obviously part of his own body. A man's body is cared for by providing for femininity. When you communicate with words that teach, you are doing that provisional job for him. And that's why it's emasculating. When you tell him the solution, he doesn't get a bump in his masculinity. But with a toxic man, he wants you to talk and talk and talk because he has no intention of changing. He knows that, but you don't. You just end up thinking he's clueless. Obviously, he needs more information from you. So when you're doing all your communicating because of all your overthinking, you're trying to solve his problem. You verbally overshare. You're giving him all the information he needs on how to bait you into the next fight. You've given him all the information directly how to hurt you. The marriage doesn't get blown up that way. You do. And that's how he gets his bump to his masculinity, by hurting you. Communication is the wrong counsel for wives. Whether she's in a true one-flesh relationship with a dysfunctional or difficult man, or whether there's a wolf in her home pretending to be a husband, your feminine embodiment, if it's healed, is how you train a man. Femininity is the reflection that he sees, not hears. Your femininity shows a healthy husband what he is so that he can self-analyze and self-teach. But this same healthy embodiment in the presence of a wolf, soft, strong, and powerful, you become more repellent to him. Toxic men are afraid of the power of balanced, healed femininity. So the more healing work you do, the better of a reflector you become. So the more truth is exposed, man or wolf. That's God's intention for femininity. I've been pretty hard on men so far. Well, not all men, just wolves in sheep's clothing. But I want to go a little bit above and beyond for that in the name of our healthy brothers in Christ. So if you'll allow me to circle back, because, well, they're fascinating in how they are so different. And the more I learn about how different we are, the more I am amazed at God, but also I end up learning more about my own femininity. In our world, sisters, the reality we live in, where the atmosphere that makes up most of our marriages is deception, manipulation, confusion, loneliness, and lots of high conflict, it can jade our view of masculinity, and mine was for a while, and I think that's normal when you first wake up to the reality of what you're married to. But masculinity is beautiful, and although it might be hard for some of you to see that yet, and that's okay, one of the hopeful statistics I leaned on goes something like this. I'm going to paraphrase. Most men are healthy and decent. Yes, some are difficult and untrained, and that makes them dysfunctional. But it's only a few diseased and toxic ones that are circulating throughout womanhood, trying to destroy the many of us. So, if you'll do me the honor of giving you a little bit of knowledge about the brothers, I'll press forward. Men learn about relationship through the experience of feeling a success or failure. It's the consequence inside their own bodies that they personally identify with. That's what allows them to learn organically. Then they self-adjust or self-correct. Self-correction is in their DNA. God made them that way. It started when they were conceived. If God chose for a creation to be inserted into a male body at a certain stage in development, the fetus consumes the female chromosomes that would continue to grow into a female. He has to, because every person starts out at conception as a female. So a man literally creates himself. That's how he possesses the ability to self-adjust and self-correct. He learns best through himself, not through being taught by another person. It's their own internal identification of this experience. It's actually pretty neat. This is hard for us to understand because we're motivated outside of ourselves. When there's a problem in your marriage, your husband doesn't want to talk about it like you do. You want to solve it more like a group social. A man doesn't function like that. He needs to solve it by himself because that's how his masculinity is rewarded, through accomplishment and doing. A man receives the highest bump to his testosterone through working. And that's why when you think your husband is doing something wrong or sinning against you or his dysfunction is hurting you, God tells wives, don't talk. Words that correct and discipline are teaching words, and you convey that from your masculine headspace. That teaching comes across just as criticism, and he shuts it down. He can't hear you. It doesn't matter if you try and use masculine words, or if you try and talk like a man, or if you try and use as few words as possible. It doesn't matter how gently you try and present in a super loving and respectful way. You are not and cannot pretend to be a man. What your husband feels from you, the vibe, the energy from you, the person who's standing right in front of him that he can see with his own eyes, is a being who's 90% estrogen. You will never be able to present like a man because he can feel your DNA. It seems like an impossible situation, doesn't it? If you can't talk about it, if you can't tell him what he's done that hurts you, how is that supposed to work? It can't. Not if you're thinking like a man. I used to get so triggered by 1 Peter 3 when God says don't talk. I felt oppressed and small, angry, helpless, powerless, and voiceless. Do you get triggered when you read 1 Peter 3? Do you feel oppressed or small? All these emotions are indicators from the Holy Spirit. It's God's proof to you that you're reading from a masculine mindset. Simply put, you're reading God's word wrong for you. You're interpreting scripture like a man in a woman's body. That means you're using your testosterone to interpret instead of the way he created you to understand it, which is with your estrogen. It's impossible to appreciate God's heart and intention towards you, his daughter, not just in 1 Peter 3, but in any verses written specifically for wives. Unless you embrace your femininity, you'll never experience the feeling of being completely loved by God as his chosen daughter. I'm not saying he doesn't fully love you. He does. You just won't feel it. You might believe that he's real and entrust your eternity to him through the choice of head knowledge. You might believe that he's love and loves everyone, which he is and does. But unless your individual personality of femininity is healed, you won't be able to experience the feeling of knowing that knowledge. You can only receive God's love into your heart as a woman embodying femininity. The core of femininity is not providing like it is for masculinity. The core of femininity is receiving. And if your heart is broken, it can't receive. That's why you live in the masculine, because living in the broken-hearted state is too painful. Men and women think and communicate on different spectrums, and it can't be both at the same time. It's important to note that part of the delusion that captures us is gender neutralizing ideas. When you hear things like men and women both possess the same energy, we both have testosterone and estrogen. The reason it's a delusional premise is because it's incomplete. It's how Satan operates. A teeny bit of truth to disguise a big lie. Yes, we both do have testosterone. A woman has 10% and a man has 90%. That's like saying my $10 is equal to your $90 because we both possess it in Canadian dollars. It's not really the same now, is it? It's not equal. It's an incomplete comparison touted in order to deceive. So beware of the intention of that kind of feminist ideology, because the church has embraced it. In this instance, it would be called something like mutual submission or egalitarian. Estrogen is not equal to testosterone, and masculinity is not equal to femininity. You can't equalize hard and soft. You can't equalize providing and receiving. Equalizing is how you neutralize the genders to make the differences disappear. Do I dare say it's sin? It just might be, because when you look at how opposite the hormonal ratios are, it seems like God's making a point for us. I remember going to a marriage conference once. I say once because it's the only one we ever went to. The presenter put up the words, "Now here," on the overhead, but he wrote it as one word. Then he asked all of us, "What words do you see? Write it down and keep it hidden." Then he said, "Put up your hands if you saw the words nowhere." And all of the men put up their hands. Well, most of the men put up their hands. I looked down at my sheet. That's not what it said. But then he said, "If you wrote the words 'now here,' put up your hand." And most of the women put up their hands. I couldn't believe what I just experienced. That was the first time I saw that there was a difference between men and women in a real, tangible way. And that word got stuck in my mind like a burr. Now here, nowhere. Now here, nowhere. How could one word be read differently by a man than a woman? It didn't make sense to me. Do you see where God was leading me with this? He was peeling back the feminist mindset that had been blinding me to his word. Earlier I had said that whenever I read 1 Peter 3, I felt small and inconsequential, helpless, powerless, and voiceless, even dismissed. Does that sound like a message a loving father wants his daughter to receive from his words? No, it doesn't. So either God is not the loving father like I believed, or it was me that was wrong. God said to me, "You're not reading me wrong. You're feeling me wrong." I thought that was weird. Lord, how can feelings be wrong? I know what I feel. Now, when the Lord wants to get my attention, he makes me wait. And it gets real quiet between us, and that's what happened. I think so in the quiet space, I'm alone with what I just said, and it's like my own voice reverberates in my brain. Finally, he said, no, you don't know how to feel anything. And that's when I started asking me the question, how do I feel about the scripture? It sounds heretical, doesn't it? If I feel contradictory to God's nature, that means I'm reading wrong. Something needs to be examined. So that's when I started asking, what do I feel and why do I feel it? 1 Peter 3 was the verse that caused me the most angst and misunderstanding. And it was the verse that allowed the most damage and abuse of my womanhood. Yet, it was that verse that God used to shine his truth through the lies that I had been believing. I found out that when I read 1 Peter 3 through a female embodied heart and mind, the ones that God had especially designed for me, I didn't feel small or dismissed or even suspicious about God. Instead, I experienced feelings of being cherished, special, and loved. I felt powerful, secure, and safe. When you understand God from your female heart, you'll see that your estrogen is actually the key He's given you so that you can navigate that romantic relationship in truth and love. 1 Peter 3 feels very different to me now. Don't let your beauty consist of outward things like elaborate hairstyles and wearing gold jewelry or fine clothes, but rather what's inside the heart, the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. Being female is who you are, not what you do. It's not the blue part instead of the pink part. It's not one or the other. It's both. When wives view their femininity like it's the elective features of hair, jewelry, and clothing, that's fake femininity. When we think that femininity is something that's optional, we'll end up feeling like an optional creature. Femininity is not an option or a gift. It's not an object that you leave on a shelf until you decide that you want to feel feminine, or like a coat that you can put on and take off whenever the situation suits you. God didn't create you as a human and then attach your femininity to you as an aftermarket installation. Being feminine is who you are. It's not what you pretend to act like from time to time. God only created two primary operating systems. You're either an XY, who creates lots of testosterone and a tiny bit of estrogen, or you're an XX, who creates lots of estrogen and a little itty bitty bit of testosterone, not both in equal amounts. That's how God balances the polarity of the one-flesh relationship inside marriage. He purposely created masculinity and femininity to be disproportionate, so that we'd experience the healthy interdependence of His one-flesh relationship. Not that toxic dynamic of dominance and codependence found in the tradition of men. I want to pause here to clarify that whenever I talk about femininity and masculinity as a polarity, or in regards to any kind of attraction, I never mean the law of attraction, which isn't scriptural because it's rooted in universalism, which is a sect of Christendom that believes that every single human will eventually be saved. The law of attraction hijacks the truth about the biology of our hormones and gives all the credit to something called the universe, instead of God, the actual creator of the estrogen and testosterone, all the energy from that estrogen and testosterone, and the bodies that house it all, and the universe itself. He tells us this in Romans 1:18 through 21. There's a lot of carryover in the terminology between true believers and false believers. It's on purpose because that's how Satan operates. He takes the truth that God has created and he twists it to be used for evil. Sowing and reaping is a spiritual law, and Satan has twisted it to remove God from the equation, and he puts humans in the place of power by telling them, you can attract whatever your heart desires, and the universe will manifest it into reality for you. It's basically the secular version of God's law of sowing and reaping. Just like earlier when I talked about the tradition of men is the secular version of the patriarchy. It removes God and puts a man in the position meant to be occupied by God. That's what makes it toxic. Okay, so I just wanted to be clear about my position. Back to treating your femininity like it's an option. The reason it takes so much work to maintain this mindset is that it's masculinity disguising itself to act feminine. That means you are pretending to be something you're not, to get something you want. Anytime you're behaving in a way that's a strategy, that means you're looking for an intended outcome. Pretending to act feminine is way more work because you're always going to have to do it. It's never going to end. You'll always have to jump back and forth between your head and your heart, and that's testosterone generated. And it gets too heavy to carry. We don't have that quantity of testosterone to carry on like that for years. Men have 20 to 30 times more testosterone. They're equipped to drive themselves, whether it's in their jobs or their relationship. And so you end up emotionally breaking yourself because estrogen was never meant to drive you or the relationship. Estrogen doesn't provide, it receives. When you act in ways that appear feminine, things like overemphasizing feminine mannerisms, styles, and behaviors, things like intentionally walking with a shorter gait, or deliberately speaking softly, or practicing purposeful elegance, like accentuating etiquette or capitalizing on modesty. You know, you can do all those actions without truly being a feminine woman in the heart. They are traits of femininity, but it's the motive that's all wrong. A woman who does that is practicing trying to provide femininity in hopes that her husband will provide headship. When you're providing, you can't receive. Providing is masculine energy driven from testosterone. It's an impossibility to receive when you're thinking like a provider. Receiving can only be experienced when you embody estrogen. And when you can't receive, that means you can't feel what's being provided in front of you. And that's deadly if you're married to a dangerous man. In relationship, genuine healed femininity will always bring out the truth of the man, whatever that truth is. If your husband is healthy, you'll eventually bring out the best that your husband was created to be. Fake femininity is more like an act that leverages techniques against him. It brings out the worst in him because he married a woman, yet you're setting before him energy that feels like provider energy, which is from testosterone. Because you're in your masculine mindset, he can feel that. Take your primary focus off the what you're going to do. In 1 Peter 3, verse 3, God's talking about the activities that you're doing here. What you're doing is always masculine driven because activities involve thinking, planning, organizing, choosing, achieving, accomplishing. But when we're broken, we judge ourselves instead of being ourselves. This is how it happens. You judge the hairstyle you do, the clothing you choose, and the jewelry you put on, and anything else that you do. I could add painted nails and toes for me. We do all these outward actions in order to receive something, the feeling of being seen. It feels good to be seen. Being seen is the essence of receiving, and we try and receive that through providing all those elements that God is talking about in verse 3. And what happens is that we end up doing it our way from brokenness instead of His way from healed. I used strategies of clothing and style to pretend to be something I wasn't. I was acting like a lady while thinking like a man. I was fake femininity. And because of this, it won't last. God won't help you be fake. It's exhausting too, like trying to maneuver yourself as a feminine creature from your testosterone. It's quite a mind job you do on yourself, and it takes a lot of energy to keep it up. Trust me, I know. I just about drove myself crazy trying to live in both polarities. What you end up doing is creating an empty shell, like a composite character of what you imagine a feminine woman is like. Eventually, there's a disconnect that's caused by trying to live out of both polarities at the same time. That disconnection is seen in the deterioration of psychological, emotional, and physical health. We've gotten our order wrong. Our starting point is backwards. When we're brokenhearted, we'll always get it wrong. We'll always start on the outside to fix or help or even hide the inside. God is telling us, particularly females in this section, where He wants us to start from, His starting point. He's saying, don't start with what actions you're doing. Instead, look at you. You have to start with examining the condition of your heart. That's where you find your being. What's inside you? What condition is she in? Why is she in that particular condition, and how did she get that way? This method of thinking lines up with the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus tells us to stop overthinking. Don't be motivated like the world is, striving for what to eat, what to drink, and what to wear. That word, what, it's not your starting point. Your starting point isn't external. It's not outside of you. It's inside of your heart, the inner person. To seek the kingdom first is where you examine your relationship with God. How are you with Him? Seeking His kingdom is not about doing external works, whether you're worrying about what to wear, your jewelry, your clothing, or your nails. It's not about any activities, even activities that are about serving in a religious capacity. Seeking the kingdom is about you as an individual woman with God, and that starts with self-examination through the female eyes of your feminine heart. Closing thoughts. First, shh. Don't say a word about this to him. Discovering that your husband's dangerous is a scary place to end up. It's never where you thought you'd be, and it feels like an unreality. But your silence about your awareness of what he really is, that's your safety zone. And always remember, a clueless guy that causes dysfunction and seems difficult, he's not dangerous. But the malignant man is not clueless. He just pretends to be difficult and dysfunctional so that he can hide how dangerous he is.